Welcome to Philosophy and Faith, where our goal is to help you navigate your intellectual and spiritual journey, especially in regards to topics like God, faith and doubt, meaning and purpose, and more. I'm Nathan Beasley.
And I'm Daniel Jepson. And together we discuss the big questions that humans have wrestled with for thousands of years.
We're glad you can join us.
All right, we're back.
Hey, Daniel.
Good afternoon, Nathan. Glad to see you again.
Yeah, excited to record some podcasts before I head out on paternity leave here.
Right. Hopefully get a couple in the bank for editing.
Yeah, so this will be good, and we have finally made it to, drumroll please,
Plato.
It's been a long time coming.
That's right, the Plato.
The Plato, not Plato.
No, telling Nate previously, I could tell I don't enunciate my words very clearly because when the transcript comes through, the written transcript of the audio, the AI always puts it as Play-Doh, like the child's plaything there. But
yeah.
No, not that kind of.
So not Plato.
No, Plato. With
unfortunately.
Yeah, that'd be fun to talk about the philosophical meanings of Play-Doh.
Yeah, the malleability of material. So
see, you're already halfway there.
Hey, that's my gift.
Maybe we'll come back to that because we could use that as illustrating some aspect of Plato's thought.
Nice.
Yeah.
So what are these next few episodes going to be?
All right. So I've only got this one and the next one sketched out. I haven't really written the script for either one. So we might go back and forth a little bit. But today we're going to talk about the influence of Plato, and then we're going to talk about his life and then his works. So that's the episode today. Kind of the background so we know the guy, what he's talking about, what he's doing. And then next week, we're going to have a little bit longer episode about the big idea of Plato, the one that has influenced Western thought more than any other philosophical idea, in my opinion, at least.
Very nice. So that's a little bit of a cliffhanger.
Yeah, I'm giving a little bit of a tease there.
I like it. So Plato. So Plato's a disciple of Socrates.
Yes.
And he is in Athens.
Yes, he is in Athens. Actually, let's back up. Before we talk about his life, let's just talk about why he's so important, why we're talking about him so much.
Okay.
We're going to devote 3 to 4, maybe even 5 episodes. Let's explain why. So he is, in my opinion, the most influential philosopher of them all. Maybe rivaled only by Aristotle, his pupil.
Okay, so that's a big statement.
It is, and not everyone's going to agree with that.
From what I've seen, a lot of people agree, at least influential in the West.
Yes.
Seems like that's pretty...
I should clarify, that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not that contentious of a statement.
Well, maybe. Probably some people would argue against it, but when you look at European and American, Canadian history, Australian, all the thought that's within that culture, I think Plato influences more than any other philosopher. And maybe any other person outside of Jesus.
So can you...
I don't know if I could defend that, but maybe.
Okay. Can you share a few of the reasons why you think he's so influential and how he's shaped our culture or society?
Yeah. Let me read a quote by Alfred North Whitehead. He was an American philosopher and mathematician. And he has a famous quote that philosophers argue about whether it's hyperbole or accurate. But he said this: "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writing. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them." Now, there are so many ideas, but in particular, the ones we're going to look at next week, I think are going to really change the history of philosophy, the history of thought. And then part of this is involved with this idea that he is really the first great systematizer.
Systematizer.
Yeah.
Okay, what does that mean?
All right. So he is the first one to really bring together all the different thinkers and all their different themes from the past in Greece, and bring together all the different thinkers and all the different thoughts from the previous philosophers, and then put them together. So he's synthesizing them, but he's also expanding the breadth of that. So some of the others, most of them talked about metaphysics, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what does reality consist of? A few of them talked about knowledge, theory of knowledge, but not very deeply. And then a very few The Stoics and a couple of the others talked about ethics. The Stoics, for them, it was an ethics more of personal self-advancement.
Mm-hmm.
Plato is the first to build a system where all those areas, those three big areas of metaphysics, what is real, or ontology, epistemology, what is true and how can we know it, and then ethics, which we value, which we do, which we choose. Those three big areas are all brought together. He's teaching on all three, and he integrates them. So the epistemology is dependent and tied into the metaphysics and the ethics as well. So he's the first one. Aristotle, you could argue, does much of the same thing. Kant certainly does that much later on, the German philosopher in the 18th century. But Plato is the first one, and arguably the one who does it most successfully in the sense of having a coherent system.
Yeah, so I mean, you open a introductory philosophy textbook, and it's going to organize kind of similarly,
Yes.
right, around your metaphysics, your epistemology,
Usually.
your ethics.
Yeah.
And so more modern philosophers will maybe take one of those categories and specialize in them, or maybe even a subcategory of those categories and specialize in them. Is that right? But he's like foundational because he and Aristotle and then Immanuel Kant and others have kind of laid groundwork for an entire system
Yes.
of philosophy. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he is the first great systematizer, and he's still one of the most prominent.
Okay.
So if you look at systematizers in the history of philosophy, I think you would say Plato, Aristotle, Thomas, Spinoza.
Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas.
Okay.
Spinoza, although his wasn't quite, to me, is successful. Other people might differ. And then Kant.
But I mean, there's a 1,600-year gap between
Right.
Aquinas and Aristotle. So there wasn't much medieval, significant medieval philosophers.
Well, there were, but they were mainly building their ideas either on Plato or Aristotle.
Okay. Gotcha.
So Augustine was an original thinker, but he's still within the Platonist tradition.
I see.
Obviously, there were many other original thinkers, not as influential as Augustine, but
So-
still within those traditions.
Okay, I got you. So those guys are most influential because they have kind of unique foundational perspectives.
Yes.
So Plato's going to be uniquely different from Kant,
Yes.
and Thomas is going to be different from Spinoza.
Right.
Okay.
Now, Thomas is going to rely on Aristotle as well, but he also expands it and Christianizes it so much that it's fair to talk about him separately.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So these are big, broad, sweeping categories, and
They are.
it makes sense why we're going to spend so much time on Plato.
Yes. And the other reason is that we talked about this a little bit last time. You can argue, and I think pretty successfully, that Christian theology, which develops in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, is really a combination of biblical revelation and Greek, and particularly Platonic thought. Because of that, Plato has a profound influence on Christian theology and even how Christians who aren't theologians think about things, in particular the soul and the afterlife and the body and so many other things. Plato is foundational to Christian theology.
Am I thinking about this correctly? A lot of that is these Hellenized or even Greek people who hear the message of Christianity, the message of Jesus, and have to synthesize that message with what they're already thinking about and try to fit it into the categories. I mean, of course, there's going to be differences and it's going to challenge that, but a lot of that is just kind of natural that they're trying to fit it into their preconceived categories of how life works.
Yes. So kind of two things, and you're on to one of them. As the church becomes less Jewish and more Gentile, it's going to be bringing in people who have been brought up in the Greco-Roman way of thought. And really, Rome adopts more than replaces the Greek ideals of culture and philosophy. So it's going to be coming to people who are already shaped by that. But secondly, once the church begins to get established and they interact with other worldviews, they want to be able to, as much as possible, show the intellectual respectability of Christianity. And the way they're going to do that is say, look, it fits in with what we all believe about the big issues of life, about these philosophical issues.
So it's like Paul at Mars Hill, right? I mean, you guys are close.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example.
But let me tell you about this God that you say is the unnamed God. I know who that is.
Right.
So he kind of honors them and that they have some sort of spiritual impulse.
Hmm.
But he takes them beyond their thinking in order to show how Jesus and, Christianity flows from the Jewish thought and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So some of the very earliest church fathers and church theologians felt like God must have been working through Plato and the other Greek philosophers because they got so much right. It's so much that fits in beautifully with how they understood the message of the Bible.
That is an interesting idea.
Yeah. Now, others like
Others would question that point.
yes, yeah. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's an interesting thought experiment for all the listeners to see. Maybe the Holy Spirit can work outside of the scriptures or the church.
sure. Yeah, and that's one thing I've kind of wrestled with my own. I've come to realize what I'm just talking about, that Christian theology is shaped by Greek thought. And the question I wrestle then with is, okay, how much of that is a good thing or even a God-given thing? And how much of that is really a perversion of biblical thought and the biblical worldview? And I could see, you could argue it either way, depending on how you interpret things. But certainly God could do that. That's certainly within his providence. Or it could be a wrong turn that we need to make a U-turn on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It certainly seems true that the Greek thought maybe paved the way for Christianity to have some connection points in their culture. But yeah, whether or not that's a good thing or it's something that we need to reject is an interesting question as well.
Okay.
So Plato. Should we jump back to Plato?
Yeah, let's jump back to
After
Plato.
that long digression. But I mean, that's the heart of the podcast here, is understanding how these things intersect and how they intersected back then, because it's the same thing today. Christianity and culture still.
Right.
There's still that ongoing conversation going on.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about his life a little bit. What do we know about his biography?
Well, there were a lot of legends that grew after this, and so we have to disentangle some of these, but the bare facts that we know. He was born in 425, possibly 426. He was an Athenian, and he came apparently from a wealthy aristocratic family. His real name might have been Aristarchus.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Aristarchus.
Aristarchus.
Yeah, one of those.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of questions about that, but I'm sure you don't know.
No, I don't. That was what one writer said about him. It's not clear. But it is clear that his name is very close to the Greek word Platon, which means broad. So a lot of people have speculated that it's a nickname that he acquired either because he was broad and burly, that's what one writer said, or because of the breadth of his teaching.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So again, that part's not clear, but probably it's a nickname referring to one of those. Yeah, he was born in Athens, 425. He was one of the people who was influenced and listened to firsthand Socrates. He did a little bit of travel. It's a little bit unclear, those middle years. But then around 388 BC, he founded a school in Athens to teach young men. Now, this is interesting. So it was located in a grove outside of Athens. And this grove was named after a Greek hero named Academos. So the grove then was called Academia.
Oh.
And his school then was called, well, in English we'd call it the Academy.
Whoa.
Yes. And of course we get our words academic and academia from that.
Wow. That's a good trivia question there.
That's right.
I like the little lesson in etymology. So he's in his 40s and he starts the school. Okay, then what?
And then, well, this school.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. You could argue that this school is actually the first European university because he doesn't just teach philosophy, but mathematics, astronomy. He even teaches some biology and botany, apparently. And then he led the academy, but he also lectured. Now, here's the deal, though. We don't have those lectures.
Wow. What if we did?
That'd
be so cool.
Yeah, people have speculated about that maybe what he does in the lectures is a little bit different than what he does in the dialogues, but there's no evidence for that. It's just speculation. But with Aristotle, you actually have the lecture notes recorded by his students that have been written down, preserved, published. So when you read Aristotle, you're reading the notes that he gave to, or the lectures he gave to his students. When you read Plato, you're reading what he wrote more for a popular audience.
Oh. So how does that
Well, it makes him a
shape?
lot more readable.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And Aristotle was one of his students, right?
Yes.
So Plato's got the school. Socrates didn't.
No.
So this is first university here. Aristotle's one of the students, and then Aristotle goes. Does he go and end up teaching and lecturing at that same?
No, he starts his own school.
Starts his own school. Okay,
The Lyceum.
I see it. Okay.
Yeah. I forget what that means. I'll talk about it. So what we have then are not his lectures, but rather about 35 or 36 dialogues. So they're separate books. They're usually short, not tremendously short. You could probably read one in 3 to 4 hours. Some of these, there are a few where the authorship is disputed, but for the most part, they're not. We have the real deal. So it's also the first philosopher that we have this wealth of material from as well.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And those dialogues, Socrates is the main character, right?
Yes,
Usually.
most of them.
Okay.
Yeah, especially in the early ones.
And they kind of develop the Socratic method.
Yes.
Okay. I'm putting the pieces together here in real time, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. All right, so that's just the bare outline of his life. His life is obviously not as important as his teaching. He didn't do anything wondrous. He wasn't martyred like Socrates, but he was an amazing teacher and communicator, that's for sure. I mean, you could argue, some people have argued that he actually started as someone interested in literature instead of philosophy because he's writing so well, his books read so well, that they feel maybe he started that way and then kind of went into philosophy. But again, that's speculation.
Do we have any notes of his teaching on mathematics or botany or any of that stuff, or he's pretty much remembered as a philosopher?
Yes, just as a philosopher.
Okay.
Now, according to tradition, above the academy there was a sign that said somehow, let none enter here who do not know mathematics. And this was because probably, unlike the Pythagoreans, remember them?
Mm-hmm.
He's not really basing his philosophy on mathematics, but rather that seemed to be this totally intellectual exercise, studying mathematics, that he really valued and prized as this is one way you have to learn to think with your mind logically.
Wow.
So, yeah. Anyway, so that's his life. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about today is the difference between Plato and Platonism.
Yes.
Yeah, so sometimes people talk about the difference between Calvin and Calvinism, the idea that his followers were more Calvinistic than Calvin himself, things like that. Well, with Plato, you kind of have that, but not quite the same way. There are really 3 different kinds of Platonism. There's one that is Plato himself. So what he taught or what he wrote down in the dialogues during his lifetime. That's Platonism in its purest form. And then the second form is usually called Middle Platonism. And this is from around 90 BC to 250 AD. And this is primarily from people who taught or led in the academy. And if you wanted to sum it up in 1 or 2 sentences, I guess you could say it's Plato, but revised and corrected by Aristotle and his followers, as well as influenced by the Stoics and some of the other philosophers. So it's Plato, but it's modified a bit in that way.
Just briefly, what would those modifications?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the theory of forms that we'll talk about.
Okay.
So Aristotle had a radically different understanding of the forms, and he had some very cogent criticism of Plato's theory of the forms. So part of it is that, and there's some other things as well. And then the third is probably the most interesting. The third is what's called Neoplatonism.
Okay.
You've heard me mention that before.
Yeah. Yeah. Neo meaning new.
Right.
So this is going to come after Middle Platonism, presumably?
It is, much later, actually. It usually dates from about 250. And then we have an end date of 539 when the Emperor Justinian shut down the school that was teaching this. Yeah, so there is an end point. So about 250 to 529. The thing is, though, that you have antecedents to that all the way into the 2nd and 1st century. What I mean by antecedents is you had ideas that were already in the air that were then later incorporated into the system of Neoplatonism. Now, we can't really go into that now because it is complex. But basically, it's a Platonism that's also a religion. So it's a religious philosophy or a philosophical religion. It's not a religion where you go and you worship and you're engaged in community. It's more of an intellectual knowledge of religious thought, basically. It's also different because it's more heavily monistic. We'll explain that term in the next episode. Think of a cocktail or a recipe. And if you mix in maybe 3 parts of Plato, 1 part Gnosticism, 1 part the mystery religions, and 1 part Old Testament, then you've got something like Neoplatonism.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And it had influence beyond itself. Some of the themes it taught were carried over into the Middle Ages, not the whole scheme, but there were certain emphasis and themes, especially about knowing God and mysticism, that carried over into the Middle Ages and even into today. But it was also conceived as the main competitor of Christian theology, philosophically at least. And so some Christian theology is a response to what's happening in Neoplatonism.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Right. So Plato is cutting a wide swath of influence.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. He and his descendants.
So real quickly, going back to the idea of it being a religion of the mind, do you just mean it becomes more intense, that people begin to get more dogmatic about it, or it begins to get coupled with religious practices? Or like, in what sense does it move beyond philosophy? Are there gatherings of people or clubs formed based on the thought, or like how? What do you mean by that?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So not religious in terms of activities. You didn't have a weekly meeting or anything like you would in, say, in Judaism or Christianity. It wasn't like that. But what's happening here, and I'm just going to paint a very broad brush, but what you have is a philosophical system that teaches that you need a salvation experience or a salvation route. So this goes beyond what most philosophy does, right? So most philosophy explains the world, maybe tells you what you should do in some situations. This one is saying you need to fundamentally change, and there is a route of salvation in a sense. But it's a salvation by knowing. That's why you have Gnosticism in there. Gnosticism means knowing, or the religion associated with that. So it's by knowing. It's not by moral repentance or belief, say, in Christ or following a covenant. But as part of that knowing, it goes beyond. There is an intellectual knowing, very, very heavily involved, but there's also a knowing that goes beyond the intellect and almost of a mystical union with the one. So in Neoplatonism, the one is going to be functionally equivalent to God, the highest thing, the most valuable thing. So they're going to take that idea from Plato and they're going to run with it and deepen it. But they would also view this idea that you can ascend towards the one by your knowledge, but you can also have this mystical union with the one in some ways. So that's the goal, and that's very different than most philosophies.
Yeah. So kind of follow-up question, is that something that also transcends death? I mean, are they talking about some sort of afterlife as well that's part of the religious element of the philosophy?
Not usually.
Okay.
I think there may be different answers to that. I'll have to think about that one more.
Okay. Well, this is great. This is exciting. Can already see the influence over the next 800 years as he goes to, as it becomes Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism.
Right.
And we're already seeing the way that that's converging with monism and Christianity and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is an interesting dynamic because Plato, as we'll talk about in the next episode, is a strong dualist, but his system lends itself to being interpreted monistically, which is interesting. Anyway, we'll come back to that.
So unpack it next week.
Yep, we'll do that.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction to Plato and his life, his work, and his influences. And until next time, this is Philosophy and Faith.
Okay. That's a nice outro.
Thanks. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you hear, click follow or subscribe depending on your platform. Check the notification bell so you're up to date with new episodes and leave us a review. Until next time.